Good evening and welcome back to the Fourscore Speaker Series. We are excited to kick off our fall session with tonight's guest, Dr. Jonathan White, as he discusses his most recent book, Shipwrecked, A True Civil War of Mutinies, Jailbreaks, Blockade-Running, and the Slave Trade. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I'm the Senior Director of Development at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation is thrilled to be leading and supporting efforts to create high-quality, award-winning educational programs, exhibits, and resources that empower individuals to learn from Lincoln's life, leadership, and legacy. For more information on how you can support this mission, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to remind you that we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box and we will get to as many as possible. And now, please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson-Mast. Erin?
Thanks, Phyllis. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the kickoff program of our Fall Fourscore Speaker Series. We're delighted to be joined once again by Dr. Jonathan White to discuss his newest book, Shipwrecked, A True Civil War Story of Mutinies, Jailbreaks, Blockade-Running, and the Slave Trade. It is all that and more. This book focuses on the story of Appleton Oaksmith, who was the son of literary parents, a sea captain whose life intersected with some of the most important moments, movements, and individuals of the mid-19th century, from the California Gold Rush to filibustering schemes in Nicaragua, Cuban liberation, the Civil War and Reconstruction. Oaksmith is one of those persons in history who, sort of like Absalom Markland, whom we heard about last spring, thanks to Candace Shai Hooper's book, is somehow part of all these key events. Kind of like a real-life Forrest Gump. He's just connected to all these famous people, and yet he was largely forgotten to history until now. White's book also goes into the extraordinary and at times questionably constitutional lengths that the Lincoln administration went through to destroy the illegal transatlantic slave trade. Oaksmith being caught up in those crosshairs is part of the driving force in this amazing story. Dr. White is Professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University. He is author or editor of over a dozen books and more than 100 articles, essays, and reviews about the Civil War. His earlier book, Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Re-Election of Abraham Lincoln, was named a Best Book of 2014 by Civil War Monitor and was a finalist for both the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize and the Jefferson Davis Prize, and won the Abraham Lincoln Institute's 2015 Book Prize. Midnight in America, Darkness, Sleep, and Dreams During the Civil War was named a Best Book of 2017 by Civil War Monitor. That's one of my favorites that you've done, John, too. His 2018 book, Our Little Monitor, The Greatest Invention of the Civil War, which was co-authored with Anna Gibson Holloway, was a finalist for the Indie Book Awards and honorable mention for the John Lyman Book Award. He's a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. He serves on the boards of the directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute and the Abraham Lincoln Association, and he's the vice chair of the Lincoln Forum. He also serves on the Ford's Theater Advisory Council, the editorial board of the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, and as editor of the Lincoln Forum Bulletin. In 2019, he won the Outstanding Faculty Award of the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, which is the highest award given to faculty in the Commonwealth. Prior to Shipwrecked, John's three most recent books were My Work Among the Freedmen, The Civil War and Reconstruction Letters of Harriet M. Buss, which he co-edited with his student Lydia Davis, and To Address You as My Friend, African American Letters to Abraham Lincoln, and then lastly, A House Built by Slaves, African American Visitors to the Lincoln White House, which was released in 2022. John, you are indefatigable, and I can't wait for what comes next, but first, let's talk about Shipwrecked. John, it's great to have you back.
Thanks so much for having me. And I think I need to send you a shorter bio for now.
I think it's important for everyone to know just how prolific you've been and how much you do every single day in service to history. And we appreciate it because it's that much more for us to get engaged in and learn more about the past. So let's kick off with the fact that, why this book? Tell us what prompted this. It reads like a biography. Was that your intention?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it actually all kind of came about in the office where I'm sitting right now at Christopher Newport University. In 2014, I started collecting letters from African Americans to Lincoln. And that turned into my book, To Address You as My Friend, African Americans' Letters to Abraham Lincoln. And when I was researching that book, I wanted to find letters from Black men and women to Lincoln that other scholars hadn't really looked at before. And so I looked at record groups at the National Archives that hadn't really been delved into by most scholars of African American history. And one of the groups I looked at was the pardon records. And I found a lot of letters from Black men and women to Lincoln seeking pardon or in pardon cases. And as I was going through the pardon case files, I found that actually a lot of slave traders were writing to Lincoln as well. I probably found, I don't know, 8 or 10 different slave traders writing to Lincoln seeking pardon. And I thought that's really interesting. So I was working on these books on African Americans, and then I started collecting letters related to the slave trade. And I thought, maybe I'll write a history of the slave trade during the Civil War. And so in 2015, I had a very talented undergraduate student named Daniel Glenn. He is now a clerk for a federal judge in Texas. He's done very well. And he was my research assistant. And I gave him a list. Here's the names of the slave traders I know about, people who were writing to Lincoln seeking pardon. And I said, go into newspapers.com and some of these other databases and just start searching, see what you can find about them. And one day he walked through the door that I can see, you all can't see, but he came into the door and I was sitting here in my chair and he said, Dr. White, have you ever heard of Appleton Oaksmith? And I thought for a moment, and I thought that's one of the strangest names I've ever heard. If I had heard the name, I wouldn't have forgotten it. And so I said, no. And he said, well, his name keeps coming up in a lot of these articles that I'm finding. And so I had Daniel keep looking and add Appleton Oaksmith to the list. And he, gave me this material. And I started to sift through it. And at first I thought, okay, I'm going to do a book on the slave trade, but I'll have a chapter on Appleton Oaksmith. But the more I dug into the story, I thought, this guy really needs a biography of his own. And so I put the other project to the side and I just focused solely on this person that nobody has ever heard of.
Yeah, well, I love the fact that even Appleton Oaksmith's name is a story itself. It's a blending of his parents' surnames. What can you tell us about the dynamics of Appleton's family?
Yeah, so Appleton's mother was a very prominent first wave feminist. And I am convinced that if the story that takes place in Shipwreck hadn't happened, we would still know her today like we know Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I mean, she was very prominent in that early suffragist movement, early women's rights movement. She was married to a man named Seba Smith, who was a journalist. And so you had these two prominent parents, a journalist father and a mother who was a prominent writer, essayist, poet, lecturer, public speaker. I mean, everyone in America, or many in America, knew her in the 1850s. And she was very progressive for her time. Now, when she was born, her name was Elizabeth Oakes Prince. And she married this man named Seba Smith. And she began going by, as a writer, she would go by Elizabeth, and then her middle name, Oakes, and then her husband's surname, Smith. But for some reason, she didn't want her kids, her boys, to have the last name Smith. Whether it was sort of her feminist sensibilities, she doesn't want the boys to just have his last name, or if she thought the last name Smith was too boring. We don't know exactly, but for whatever reason, she got the New York State legislature to legally change her son's last names. And she took her maiden middle name and then her husband's last name, her married last name, and smushed them together, got rid of a couple letters, and turned it into Oaksmith. And actually, that facilitated the research in a way, because Oaksmith is a made-up last name. And so if you go into a database searching for that last name, you're going to find one of her sons or one of their descendants.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, and as you mentioned, he comes from more of a literary family. His father's a journalist, his mother's a prominent writer and speaker. He himself does dabble in poetry throughout his life, but as a career, he chooses to hit the high seas. Can you talk a little bit about how he got into that and if you will, a little bit of the history of that within their family, because he wasn't the first.
That's right. So spoiler alert, I call the book Shipwrecked because dozens of people drown in this book. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a really tragic 19th century story. You mentioned the title and how many aspects of it there are. The subtitle was actually twice as long when I first wrote it.
I believe it.
Sort of 19th century title, and I had to cut it down a little bit. It's still pretty long, though. But there's all these different aspects of the maritime world that his family were involved in. And it went back to his grandfathers. They were sea captains. Some of them drowned at sea. And I've actually connected with some of his descendants, his great-great-grandchildren who are still alive. And many of them are they still live lives at sea. Some of them are part of the fishing community in Alaska. Some of them are part of boating communities on the Pacific coast or in the Ozark Mountains on the lakes in Missouri and Arkansas. I mean, it's still a very maritime family. And so his mother raised her children, her boys, to be, well educated. Appleton knew 4 languages. He was very well educated. He wrote poetry, but his heart was always kind of pulled to the sea. And so his first ship sailing voyage, as far as I could tell, he was 16 years old, and he went as a young sailor going aboard a merchant ship to China. And that, I think, really, set a fire in him to want to stay sailing.
Well, I'm going to take that last comment about a fire to stay sailing as a pun for the fact that when he finally captains a ship, that's when he's heading out to California, correct?
Yes.
And he's it's the California Gold Rush, and he's buying and selling cargo on these ships. And it's also at a time when San Francisco is going up in flames, literally, multiple times. Can you tell us about that episode in his life, that period in his life, and how that sort of sets him up for the misfortune that he has later?
Yeah. So in the 1840s, by the 1840s, his parents' marriage is really crumbling. They stay married until his father dies because his mother was generally against divorce, although later in life she's okay with some of her sons getting divorced if that would be more convenient. But at any rate, their marriage was crumbling. And so Appleton would go with her to these literary soirees in New York City and interact with some of the greatest writers of the 19th century, people like Edgar Allan Poe, Horace Greeley, a lot of the most prominent writers. And at one of these meetings, he appears to meet a beautiful young woman and fall in love with her, but it doesn't work out. And so at the end of the 1840s, he's completely heartbroken, and he gets on a boat and he goes around South America and winds up in San Francisco. And he's getting there during the gold rush. And the incredible part is he keeps a journal all the way on this trip. And so you see, I mean, he writes about the women he's encountering in South America and the people who try to sell him mummies and all this crazy stuff going on. When he gets to San Francisco, he gets there thinking, this is where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. But there was an incredible amount of crime in San Francisco, and a lot of it involved arson, and the city, huge swaths of the city are just being burned down over and over and over again. And he sees his friends losing everything and rebuilding and losing everything again. And they set up what's called a vigilance committee to try to bring law and order, but it's an extra legal way of bringing law and order. So he feels uncomfortable about that. And he winds up acquiring a ship in San Francisco called the Mary Adeline. And he decides, this isn't where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. I'm going to head back to sea. And he goes back around South America in search of a new cargo. Do you want me to? I can tell what happens on that trip.
I was going to just comment that there are a lot of extrajudicial things that happen throughout this book. And with you commenting on that, I was just thinking that happens a lot throughout. And it's happening at all levels of society too, which is interesting. But yeah, if you could take it a step farther into what happens next.
Yeah. So he goes around the coast of South America, and he again is keeping a journal, and in his journal he's talking about his interactions with he's brought some passengers on and they have a mutiny and he kicks them off, and his sailors, his crew almost has a mutiny and he snuffs that out. And all the while he's trying to find a cargo that will take him home, take him back to New York City where his family is. But he can't find one. And eventually he gets to Rio de Janeiro, and the Brazilian government fires on him as he's entering the harbor because he's a strange ship. But he gets into the harbor, and while he's in Rio, he somehow gets into business with a Portuguese trading company. And we'll never know exactly what he was doing or what he knew. The best we have to go on is what's in his journal and then what we know from the record of what happens next. But this Portuguese company gives him a cargo and says, we want you to take this to the Congo River. Now, that's very suspicious because the Portuguese are central to the slave trade, the illegal slave trade in the 19th century. So I have very little doubt that this Portuguese firm was involved in the slave trade. The question is, was Appleton involved? And at this point, I'm not convinced that he was. So he gets the cargo in Rio. He crosses the Atlantic Ocean over to the west coast of Africa. And when he gets there, he encounters two British ships who were part of the Africa Squadron. Now, under the international law at the time, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, it was illegal for British sailors to search American ships for evidence of slave trading. So when the British approached Appleton, he could have said, you cannot come on my ship, but he welcomes them on. And we don't know for sure, but you have to kind of imagine these British Royal Navy men are looking around, seeing is there evidence of slave trading. And we know that these particular ships were active in searching for slave traders because I looked at records at the British National Archives and they had captured a slave trader a week earlier. So they knew what they were doing. And my sense is that they didn't see any evidence of slave trading. So they have some dinner together and Appleton writes about it in his journal and then they go on their way. Well, Appleton then tries to take the ship onto the Congo River, and the current of the Congo River is very, very strong. It's so strong that as it takes him days to try to get in, and when he finally gets around a point called Shark's Point, his ship gets beached on the shoreline. And at that point, 3,000 African warriors on the side of the river come up and attack his ship, and they would have killed him, except for these British who were searching for slave traders come to his rescue. They fight off the African warriors. They put men aboard a ship to unload the cargo so that the ship becomes lighter and rises up and becomes free from the side. And he winds up becoming, leaving as fast as he can and sailing back to America. This made international headlines. And this incident, it was called the Battle of the Congo. It's in newspapers all over the Atlantic world. People have written about it in the modern era as scholars as evidence of him slave trading. I'm not 100%. I'm not convinced. If he was on a slave trading voyage, my sense is he didn't know it yet. There were times where slave trading corporations and captains and so forth would sort of force people into it once they got to Africa. And my sense is he didn't set out on this voyage to be involved in the slave trade, but many would come to think that maybe he was.
Okay. Well, and that's helpful to understand some of the context for how he later gets cast as someone who's been engaged in the slave trade for a long time. And when I read that section of your book, I had to imagine that had he refused the British boarding his ship, they might not have been so willing to help him out when he found himself in such trouble. So it certainly worked out in his favor. You mentioned, if I remember correctly, there were songs that were written by some of the British sailors. There's a ditty that he has that's in his honor now. So it made me wish that, I wanted to read all these songs and hear how they sounded and things like that too. So
and those show up in the newspapers. If memory serves correct, I think the New York Times published those songs. That's
amazing.
I mean, it was big news.
Yeah, that's amazing. But it also relates to, and this is sort of like, this is a thread throughout the whole book, that a big part of this story is the Lincoln administration attempting to crack down once and for all on the transatlantic slave trade, right? Mm-hmm. So if I remember correctly, it was outlawed in 1808, January 1808, and yet it's still persisting over half a century later. And as we all know, logically, just because something's illegal or unconstitutional doesn't mean it stops happening. Why was it so difficult to enforce? You mentioned a little bit about that American vessels didn't have to allow other nations to board. But tell us a little bit about why that was so difficult to enforce.
Sure. So the British abolished the slave trade and they begin negotiating with nations around the world, allow us to search your ships for evidence of slave trading. And that does a great deal to really hurt the illegal Middle Passage. Americans will not allow the British to search American ships. They have a memory of the War of 1812 and earlier. They remember this, the British impressing American sailors and forcing them into the British Navy. And so the thought of allowing the British onto our ships to search for things is repugnant to Americans. Even anti-slavery people like John Quincy Adams, John Quincy Adams said it would be worse than slavery to allow the British to do this sort of searching.
Yeah,
So
a little hyperbole there, but yeah. So, yeah.
What's that?
I said a little hyperbole there.
Yeah,
but...
very much so. So there's, the British are able to search all the ships pretty much except for American ones. The Americans can search American ships. And what often happens is if there's an American ship and they think there's an American slave trader and they think it's an American ship pursuing them, they put up a flag of another nation. Or if they think it's the British, they put up the American flag. And so they try to evade being searched depending on who they think is searching them. Now, let's assume, and this did happen, that an American ship captures an American slave trader. Well, they bring them back to the United States. And the problem there is, even though most people believe that the slave trade was immoral, they may be pro-slavery, but they recognize just how inhumane the slave trade is. The federal government is still not willing to enforce the slave trade laws. So not only was slave trading made illegal in 1808 by Thomas Jefferson, in 1820, they declared slave trading to be piracy, so you could be executed for it. But juries in the United States are not willing to convict. Judges tend to issue rulings in a way that are favorable towards the accused. When juries are not sequestered, they're often bribed. The prisoners, the men who are slave traders who get arrested for slave trading, oftentimes they bribe their jailers and escape. On some occasions, the slave traders are allowed to just walk out of jail and pretend like they're a gentleman and have fancy dinners. I mean, it's absurd. And so even though slave trading is illegal since 1808, it becomes piracy in 1820. No one is ever punished in any serious way for the next 40 years. It's not until Lincoln takes command that he, in May of 1861, says to his Secretary of the Interior, I want you to destroy the transatlantic slave trade. He has his Secretary of State negotiate a new treaty with the British that allows them to search the American vessels. He has his U.S. marshals really enforce searching on the docks, looking for slave traders. And Lincoln is the first guy to execute, first and only president to execute a slave trader. And he's the only person who really enforces the law.
Yeah, well, and it's also happening in the midst of the Civil War. You mentioned in May of 1861 is when this starts to kick off. So pulling a little back from that, with 1860 and the secession crisis, here we have Appleton Oaksmith again. He pops up. Yep. So quickly, there was a question from someone in the audience that I'm going to ask you now because it relates to part of what we just covered. But we talked about that he was trying to find cargo and trying to use, to buy and sell and to get his way home and things like that. But what cargo was he bringing from Brazil to the Congo?
That's a great question. So one of the historians who wrote about this about 50, 60 years ago said, well, I think Appleton was involved in the slave trade because he never mentioned what his cargo was. Mm-hmm. And that was suspicious. Now, my response to that was he actually never talked about any of his cargoes in that period. And I've looked through a lot of his records. So we don't know. We don't know what the cargo was, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's a great question, though. I wish we knew.
Yeah. So let's go back to the secession crisis and Appleton Oaksmith, because he was one of many people who tried to broker some kind of peace. He wasn't successful, obviously, but what was his strategy and what was the aim?
Yeah, so by 1860, late 1860, early 1861, Appleton has somehow gotten involved in Tammany Hall Democratic politics in New York City. So there are two major political party machines in New York City at the time. They're both Democratic. One is Tammany Hall, one is Mozart Hall, and he's involved with Tammany Hall, which is the most famous. He's not one of these top people in Tammany Hall, but he's sort of a mid-level functionary. And when the South starts to secede in December of 1860, many in the North say, we've got to figure out a way to compromise with the secessionists, get them not to go to war, stop the Civil War from happening. And in January of 61, Appleton, working through Tammany Hall, starts organizing these pro-union rallies. And he tries to be bipartisan. So he writes 2 letters to William Seward, who at that point is senator from New York. He's about to become Lincoln's Secretary of State. And he writes to Seward and he says, look, let's put partisanship behind us. This is a crisis. Let's join hands and work together for the sake of the Union. But then he includes some resolutions and he says to Seward, can you agree to these statements? And the statements are basically borrowed from the Crittenden Compromise, and they give way too many concessions to the South. They don't recognize the immorality of slavery. They say the South has been wronged and we've got to treat them right. And those are things that Seward is never going to go along with. And Seward just ignores Appleton. Appleton holds a couple of meetings and people show up at these meetings, and he really bluffs a lot. At one of these meetings, he's trying to get the attention of the rest of the people. And he says, well, what if I have a letter from the president, like President Buchanan? And so one of the guys, a guy named Billy Wilson, who's a bare knuckle boxer in New York City and would go on to become a really important New York colonel during the Civil War, Billy Wilson says, well, do you have this letter? And, he eventually realizes that Appleton is just BSing him and doesn't really have it. And so these meetings never really go anywhere. They adopt some resolutions to try to call for peace commissioners to go to the South. They send letters to the South, and these letters are actually still in archival collections in South Carolina and Georgia and other places. But then the war comes quickly and nothing comes of these endeavors.
Yeah, I loved the way that you sort of set the scene for those meetings and his attempts to bluff his way through some of this and like fake it till you make it kind of energy that's coming from Appleton Oaksmith, and it just doesn't serve him well. So that doesn't work out maybe the way that he hoped. And he does wind up trying to go back to shipping after that. And that's where the troubles really begin. So
Right.
Can you tell us the story of how Appleton gets caught up in the Lincoln administration's efforts to crack down on the transatlantic slave trade?
So we have to go back a couple of years. In the 1850s, he gets involved in the filibustering campaigns in Nicaragua, and he's at every major moment of the 19th century. So
wasn't he like declared the minister plenipotentiary of Nicaragua?
Yeah, he becomes the ambassador, or he tries to be the ambassador to DC. The administration seems like they're about to recognize him and then winds up saying, we're not going to recognize you. But he is one of William Walker's right-hand men. And then he's involved in Cuban liberation, and he's basically a gun runner for Cuban liberation. So he's getting these ships together and sending them down into the Gulf of Mexico to try to then like sail around in circles until he can get word about where they need to go. And he winds up in federal court for this. They seize his ships. He winds up in federal court. He lies. I mean, he said, "Oh, I wasn't gun running here. It was none of that." And in his journals and in his private correspondence, he's honest, and in some of the public statements, less so. And he loses his shirt. In these endeavors, he loses everything. In 1859, his family starts a magazine called The Great Republic. I was actually able to buy a copy on eBay recently for $30, which was pretty cool. But this magazine doesn't work out. And so by the time of the secession crisis, when he's doing this Tammany Hall stuff, he's flat broke. And he winds up, and I don't know how this happened, but he winds up going into business with a fish oil factory owner on Long Island. And this is where so that was the long lead up to your question. So
is Appleby the?
Yeah, Jacob Appley.
Okay.
So he and Jacob Appley decide that for whatever reason, they need whale oil for this fish oil factory. Now, the problem is that the whaling industry has tanked in the previous 2 years. Petroleum was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. You go to the old whaling towns, Nantucket, New Bedford, there are stockpiles of whale oil. They can't sell it because of the discovery of petroleum. And so nobody new is getting into the whaling industry. But when Appleton in New York City goes to someone and says, hey, I want to buy your old whaling vessel, I'm going to get into this business, it looks really suspicious. And so the people sell him their ship and they pocket his money. They sell him a ship called the Augusta, but then they immediately go to Lincoln's new U.S. Marshal in New York City and they say, we think this guy is going to get involved in the slave trade. And the federal government then begins sort of watching him, and eventually they swoop in and arrest him. And what, you mentioned a minute ago about how there's all these sort of illegalities that are a part of the story. I did a book a few years ago, 12 years ago now, a long time ago, called Abraham Lincoln and Treason in the Civil War. And it's a history of the suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War and how Lincoln suspended the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus to go after people who were disloyal. And they actually used that as a justification to arrest Appleton. They didn't have the evidence for slave trading yet. They suspected him, so they couldn't really arrest him for that. And so what do? They say, well, we think maybe he's disloyal. Now, he wasn't disloyal. I mean, he had been trying to put on these pro-union meetings 6 months earlier, but they use the suspension of habeas corpus and the charge of disloyalty as an excuse to be able to arrest him and then throw him in military prison and then also seize his ship.
Yeah, and not just once, but more than once. It's sort of he's stuck within this system then, because when he gets out and tries to take off on his ship, then he gets rearrested, right? And he's locked up in Fort Lafayette at first, yep. I believe. And you did just a masterful job of writing that part, John, in a way that leaves the reader wondering, when's this other shoe gonna drop?
Right.
Is he guilty? Is he an inhuman liar? Or is Robert Murray, the marshal, is he paranoid and power hungry? What's going on here? And I like the way you talk about how his family then gets involved too in trying to get him released. Can you talk about his experience at Fort Lafayette?
Yeah, so he gets thrown in prison at Fort Lafayette, which is no longer there. It's a military installation in I guess the East River area in the harbor, and he is in a casemate, and we actually have an image of casemate number 2 where he was in prison because some very famous Confederate prisoners were put there in 1865 and someone made an image of it 4 years later. So he's in there with some prominent people, including a former US senator from California who gets arrested for disloyalty. And all the while that he's in prison, his mother, who again, remember, is this very prominent writer, is writing to Lincoln and writing to Seward and saying, my son's not disloyal. You've got to release him. All these charges against him, they're not true. You got to release him. Appleton's wife is, who we'll probably talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, we will.
Writing to Lincoln and pleading. And, Lincoln's correspondence is really interesting because most of the letters that Lincoln received got sort of funneled out through the federal bureaucracy and are now housed at the National Archives in different record groups, depending on where in the bureaucracy they went. The letters that meant something to Lincoln are kept in his personal papers. And Appleton's mother, her letter to Lincoln is in his personal papers at the Library of Congress within the care of our friend Michelle Crowell. And that shows you that Abraham Lincoln knew who his mother was. And incidentally, when Abraham Lincoln was a young man in his 20s, he loved reading the stories written by Appleton's father. So Lincoln may not have known who Appleton was, but he knew who his parents were. And so his mother and his wife are writing to Lincoln, trying to get him released. Eventually, an order comes in and he gets sent up to Boston. And there he's thrown in Fort Warren, which is still in Boston Harbor. It's a national park site, and you can go there today. And I've been there. It's a really cool site to visit. And there he's imprisoned with the Maryland State Legislature because they were all arrested in September of '61 and thrown in prison because Lincoln feared they were going to vote for secession. And the state legislators, they want nothing to do with Appleton Oaksmith because they think, well, he's a slave trader and, we don't want to have anything to do with him. So they really shun him and he's isolated. And the poetry he writes there is really sad. I mean, he's in prison. He claims innocence. No one will talk to him. And it's very sad poetry. And finally, in January of '62, word comes that he's going to be released. And he thinks, ah, my day has finally come. And he doesn't know that behind the scenes, the U.S. Marshal and U.S. Attorney in New York have been working with the U.S. Marshal and the U.S. Attorney in Boston. And they've basically worked together to say, we're going to arrest him and try him in Boston for slave trading. And so as soon as he gets out of the fort, thinking he's free, the federal marshal from Boston is there to swoop in and arrest him. And he's thrown in a civil prison now.
And that's Charles Street Jail in Boston,
Right.
correct? And so I'm going to dip back here into your prologue, which I have to say is one of my most favorite prologues I've read in recent memory.
Thanks.
And sometimes maybe people skip the prologues. I never do. And this one is well worth your time to read for everyone listening. You begin by describing what someone would see today if they went to the Charles Street Jail in Boston, where Oaksmith was held. And you start off by explaining that that it was established in 1851 as well, used as a jail until it was abandoned in 1990. And now if you go there, you'll see that it's a luxury hotel, ironically named the Liberty. And you describe it in such vivid detail. Can you tell us, I take it you went there, because if you didn't go there, you pulled off an incredible description of the
thanks.
space.
I've been there twice now.
Okay.
I went there once when I was doing research, and then once after I did research, and I just kind of wanted to go back. It's an extraordinary building, and for anyone in Boston, you should go there and check it out. It's very expensive. If you stay there, you're paying $600 a night.
Oh,
and
wow.
The meals, I mean, I took my wife and kids there for lunch once, and it was way over $100. It might even been close to $200. It's not cheap, but for me it was worth it because I wanted to be in the place where Appleton was, and kind of I needed to see it to better understand it. And I got the old plans, and I'm pretty well convinced the original plans, and then I figured out where his cell was, and I'm pretty sure that his cell was in what is now a restaurant called Clink. And so I've had lunch and dinner right outside of where I think Appleton's cell was. It's this extraordinary building, and the funny thing about it is, because again Appleton was a prominent figure, while he was in prison, the guard just kind of let him do what he wanted. And so he would walk around the guard room, and when they locked up all the other prisoners, they wouldn't lock him up. They would let him stay out and read and talk and eat and swap stories, and then when he was ready, he would go to bed. And because he was something of a celebrity, people wanted to come and see him. They even let him hang newspapers over the bars of the door and windows so that people couldn't look in. That's going to wind up having some major implications for what happens.
For sure. But first, he finally gets his trial, because throughout this whole thing, I think that we have to acknowledge the fact that he was being intentionally denied counsel, that some attorneys were offering to represent him. He was trying to reach out to others, and that was being denied. He does ultimately get represented by his uncle. Is that right? And then Richard Henry Dana Jr., which is going to be a recognizable name to a lot of people listening, winds up being the prosecutor, correct?
Yep.
And so can you tell us a little bit more? I thought his I guess, opening-ish statements about it were just stunning to me, because I have it quoted here that he said that Appleton was, quote, the recognized head and agent of an immense slave trading organization, and that the only reason he's escaped justice this long is because of bribes. So it's not just like one ship or two ships that they're saying he's somehow, connected to, but now they're claiming this sort of broader criminal conspiracy. All this while Appleton's still proclaiming his innocence, but where is this sort of charge coming from? And it's circulating in the press, and it's just completely wrecking his reputation and his family's reputation. You mentioned the isolation that he was feeling. His family was starting to get that kind of blowback too. So what did you make of this when you were uncovering this research? Were you finding evidence that he was that guilty, or was this simply sort of wrong place, wrong time, in denial? How did he become such a target, and why do you think he was being presented this way in court?
Yeah, this is the $1 million question. And the question I often get is, did he really do it?
Yeah.
And the answer that and in some ways, I know this will be an unsatisfying answer for people, and to the watchers, still go get the book, read the book. Like but some readers might not like the approach I take. And the approach I take is to lay out the evidence and let it unfold. And I try to do it almost in a journalistic way where the reader uncovers what happens as it happens, and you get Appleton's arguments for what he did, and you get the prosecution's argument for what they say he did. And I leave it to the reader to encounter this. And I think Richard Henry Dana was wrong when he said that he was part of this massive slave trading empire, because I think that if that was true, there are some wonderful books that look at the slave trade. John Harris did one called The Last Slave Ships, and there are others. And Appleton's name comes up in these books, but never at the center of what we know about the massive slave trading rings in New York City by 1860. So I don't think he was that. Is it possible he was outfitting these ships for the slave trade? It is possible, but this is what makes it so hard. He was not charged and then convicted with slave trading. He was charged and convicted of outfitting ships for the slave trade. And what that means is they suspected him of wanting to go on slave trading voyages. They caught him before he did it, and they had to go on board and look at what was in the hull of the ship and determine, do we think he was really doing a whaling voyage, or do we think he was doing a slave trading voyage? And he claimed, I was going on a short-term whaling voyage, and that's why I didn't have everything you would expect on a 3-year whaling voyage. And they said, no, we think you're doing a slave trading voyage. And ultimately he was found guilty. And now but then part of the evidence, and I don't want to spoil all of this, because again, I think it comes out, it's really fun in the book. I think his defense was pathetic.
I love the gallery of the weeping women. I think was my favorite part of the defense there.
I mean, they get like 13 women and girls to just sit around him. And it's like, look at this guy. How could he be guilty of all these women next to him and his little girl at his feet? And at one point, they have his sister-in-law testifying about what a great guy he is, and she faints. And as she's falling in the witness stand, he gets up from the defense table and runs and catches her before she hits her head. And the jury was apparently just, oh, I can't believe it. Like in Victorian America, I guess maybe that had a shot of working. I don't know if that would work today. Ultimately, it didn't work, and he is found guilty. And I do think, he was trying to make the case that he wasn't buying a particular ship in New Bedford. And I think the evidence is there that he was trying to buy that ship. Why he and his lawyer decided to take that approach makes no sense to me, but that's what they did. And it was sensational. The newspapers, again, were reporting on this. Readers were captivated by this incredible story, and famous people were going to watch the trial in Boston.
Yeah, trial of the century there. Well, except for not, because an important backdrop to Appleton's story is that of, you referenced earlier, the only person in the United States to be executed for having engaged in the slave trade under the 1820 piracy law, Nathaniel Gordon. How does Gordon's story relate to what was happening to Appleton Oaksmith?
So Gordon is executed on February 21st, 1862. And that is right after Appleton winds up in civil prison. So while he's awaiting his trial, he knows that Gordon has just gone to the gallows. And Appleton could not have been executed for what he was accused of, because Gordon was caught with 897 Africans on his ship. He was caught red-handed. The evidence was clear. It took 2 trials, because the first trial was prosecuted under, still with some vestiges of Buchanan's administration. When Lincoln takes over, Lincoln and his people make sure he gets executed. Because Gordon was for piracy, he could be executed. Appleton, the worst he could get would be 5 years in prison, because he was convicted of outfitting a ship for the slave trade.
Mm-hmm. But he doesn't stay in Charles Street Jail long enough to get sentenced, right?
That's right.
He doesn't wait around for that, if you will. And there are pleas for leniency, and those are all falling on deaf ears. But then he escapes. Can you tell the story, or as much as you're willing to tell about the escape? I feel like we are letting out all the spoilers, but it is still, everyone should go buy the book. It is such a fun read. You won't regret it. There's so much more that we can't cover here tonight, but tell us the story of his escape.
Yeah, so he is awaiting sentencing, and it is early in the morning on September 11th, 1862. And again, I mentioned how, so I'll preface this by saying we don't know exactly how he did it. His family lore was that he dressed as a woman and walked out that way, but the guy had a huge beard. I doubt that. I doubt that's how he did it. What I think happened, I think this particular night, September 10th, the guards let him hang out in the guard room. He's swapping stories, reading newspapers. They go off to check on the other prisoners, and they just figure when night, when he's tired, he's going to go in his cell, and then we'll lock the gate. And that's what they did every night. And I think on this particular night, late at night on the 10th, he didn't do that. I think he went and hid. And then when he set up his bed so that it looked like there was a body in there, and again there's newspapers hanging over the windows and the door, so they peeked their heads in, they saw what looked like a body, they locked the door. And I can't prove this, but I think he just kind of hung out hiding in the prison all night, and then the next morning they would wake up some of the prisoners very early to go down into the kitchen and cook breakfast for everyone else. And I think it was at that point that he was able to make his way down somehow without being detected out into the prison yard and over the wall. And it was a very high wall, but later in the day, they found that there was a ladder leaning against the walls, and they had been doing construction there. So I think he got this ladder from the construction, made his way over the wall, and he then makes his way to Havana, Cuba, where his brother has been hiding out for a couple of years. And now Appleton is going to be in exile in Havana.
Yeah. Well, and then so he's back he's in Cuba, he's in Havana. And then part of the story that I found interesting there is that you bring up in two different cases, both for him and then is it Arguelles?
Arguelles, yeah. I say Arguelles, but I might be saying it wrong.
Okay, Arguelles. He is in the United States, and there are people in the United States calling for Appleton Oaksmith's extradition. There are people in Cuba calling for Arguelles's extradition. And you bring up that one of the problems there is that there's no extradition treaty between Spain and the United States. And so this wildly leads to kidnapping and kidnapping plots. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Appleton spends about 2 years in Havana. And at first he recuperates his health. And up to the point of his imprisonment, he had been pro-Union, but now he becomes pro-Confederate. He writes pro-Confederate poetry, and he becomes a Confederate blockade runner, running cotton between Havana and Galveston. And he has several high-speed chases on the Gulf of Mexico. And all this while, the United States wants to get him back, and the consul in Havana is keeping tabs on him. And as you mentioned, there was a Cuban slave trader who escapes to Manhattan. And so the Spanish and the Cubans say, we want our guy back. And the Americans say, well, we want Appleton Oaksmith back. And as you alluded to, there was no extradition treaty between the United States and Spain. And so what I think happened, and I tried to get the records from the Spanish National Archives in Madrid, but they will not allow people to photograph in their archives. So I tried to hire someone there to take pictures, and I couldn't. But I was able to piece this together using other records. What I think happened was that Secretary of State William Seward, who had been after Appleton since 1861, he met with the Spanish minister in Washington, D.C. And I think they said, look, you kidnap our guy, we'll kidnap your guy, and we'll swap. Doesn't matter that we don't have an extradition treaty. And so
wild.
The very same U.S. Marshal who arrested Appleton in 1861 under the suspension of habeas corpus arrests the Cuban slave trader in Manhattan, and they send him back to Cuba, where he gets 19 years at hard labor. The Cuban police show up at the house where Appleton is staying somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight, and they break in and they go through and they find this man very sick in bed. And they say, get out of bed and come with us. And the sick man says, who are you? And what are you doing? And they say, it's none of your business. Just you're under arrest. You're coming with us. And they get him outside. And then someone says, is it really him? And they go in and they ask a servant, do you have a photograph of Appleton Oaksmith? And the servant goes and gets a picture, and they say, oh, that's not him. So they go back, and it turns out they had kidnapped or tried to kidnap Appleton's brother. Somehow, we don't know how, somehow Appleton got word of this impending arrest, and he escaped from Havana, made his way to Canada, where we won't tell this story. You got to read the book because it's wild. He got a mail order divorce from his wife, married his cousin, and then makes his way to England, where he'll stay until 1872.
Yeah, well, and the one part about that story that I'll quote is when you referred to Indiana as the divorce mill of its time, because it was apparently so easy to get a divorce from Indiana. So we have 10 minutes left, and we could go on and on and on, John, because there are so many other questions I have for you, but let's turn to some more audience questions. So Raymond asks, if Oaksmith comes from an urbane, educated family, wouldn't he have been wary of Portuguese asking him to ship a cargo, especially if at that time they had that reputation and 300 years of experience in the slave trade? Shouldn't that have tipped him off? And I guess part of the question there might be, can he really plead ignorance if this is such a known thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. He probably should have known better, but he also was short on money and he needed income. And so the best way to do that was to carry passengers or a cargo. He had been carrying passengers from San Francisco down to South America, but he actually kicked them off his ship because they had been complaining to him, you're going too slow, and he was so sick of it that he kicked them off. Now, maybe that was a bad business decision on his part. So he for him to stay in business as a sailor at that point, he needs a cargo that he can transport and make money. And so he may have been driven by ill judgment in that case.
I love that you referenced the time that he kicked the passengers off, because you included, and I have to recount this just because I thought it was so hilarious, that he's getting so sick of their complaints and their gripes. And then when they get to their destination and find out that not only did they beat all the other ships that left at the same time, but some that left 10 days earlier, and they sort of are all sheepish, and you could tell that he's just even, and maybe it's projecting, that he's taking pleasure in kicking them off after they've come to that realization. So question 3 comes from Michael, who asks, was Appleton close to the leaders of Tammany Hall? And that itself was a corrupt crowd to be tied into. So I'll tack a question on to the end of Michael's there. That is his Tammany Hall reputation maybe part of why it's easier to attach some of these negative, sort of conspiracy corruption charges to him?
That's a great question. As far as I can tell, the only activities I can find for him involved with Tammany Hall is this very brief period in maybe December of 60 to January of 61. So I have not found any other evidence. To be fair, I didn't go through the papers of some of the leaders of Tammany Hall. I went to New York Historical and New York Public Library, and I tried to find anything I could that connected to his family, and I did find a lot up there. I didn't find anything else connecting him to Tammany Hall. There was a recent book on Tammany Hall, maybe about 4 years ago. I got that. There was no mention of Oaksmith, as I recollect in that. So I think this was just sort of I don't know. He just somehow gets involved in everything in the middle period of the 19th century, and it's always for a very short period of time, and he kind of bounces from one thing to the next. So the gold rush to filibustering to Cuban liberation to Tammany Hall to secession to and so I think it was just one of many things. I think he was always kind of grasping for things that might bring success, and that was probably just one of them.
We have another question, and it's whether, and we haven't dug into this quite as much, but did Lincoln know Appleton Oaksmith? So you mentioned that Lincoln was certainly familiar with his dad, who had a very popular comedic character that he wrote in the style of. He was familiar with his mother's poetry. How well would Lincoln have known Appleton Oaksmith?
Yeah, I don't think Lincoln was very aware of Appleton. William Seward was. Seward was at the center of the pursuit of Appleton from the fall of 1861 all the way till the end. And so Appleton's mother, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but I just can't help myself. Appleton's mother is pursuing pardon throughout Lincoln's administration, and Seward is just not letting that happen. Lincoln dies, and then Appleton's mother goes to Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson is on the verge of pardoning Appleton. And at that point, his now jilted ex-wife finds out, and she rushes to the White House and meets with Andrew Johnson and says, my ex-husband's a scoundrel, don't pardon him. And the incredible irony is that Andrew Johnson, the guy who pardons every ex-Confederate, refuses to pardon Appleton Oaksmith. And then it's not until 1872 that Ulysses S. Grant becomes convinced that Appleton is innocent. And at that point, Seward is dead, and the prosecutor, Richard Henry Dana, tries to persuade the administration not to pardon him, but Grant becomes convinced he's innocent, and so Grant finally grants a pardon in 1872. But so the presidents, Johnson and Grant are aware of who he is, but he's a minor figure, and they're much bigger sort of political worlds. I mean, they're thinking about Reconstruction and wars in the West and so forth. But Appleton does come to their attention.
Yeah. Well, and you referenced Seward, and he really does pop up throughout this entire story. And he's not painted. I mean, certainly Elizabeth Oaksmith has some choice words about Seward. She's no fan. But one of my favorite quotes that you had in the book comes from his fellow cabinet member, Secretary Wells, when he says that Seward, quote, has queer fancies for a statesman, and in administering the government, he seems to have no idea of constitutional and legal restraints, but acts as if the ruler was omnipotent. So we have a few more questions, but I also want to get in here that throughout you reference that he boasted of having the little bell, and there are references to this little bell that pop up throughout the book that come across as particularly despotic, which I have to admit I never thought of Seward in that way. But what was he boasting about there? What purpose did that serve?
Yeah, Seward very famously in 1861 said to the minister from England that he could ring a bell and it would order the arrest of someone far off in a distant part of the country. And even the Queen of England didn't have that sort of power. And that metaphor, that idea is present throughout the book, because Elizabeth Oaksmith, so her diaries, many of them are preserved. She burned a ton of her stuff, which is just tragic. But because she's an important writer, the New York Public Library acquired a lot of her papers, and so did the University of Virginia. And so I've read her diaries in both places, and she writes about this little bell all the time, because for her, Seward is a despot. He's a tyrant. He's abusing his power. He doesn't care about constitutional limitations, and her son is the victim. And the conservative members of Lincoln's cabinet, when Seward negotiates this prisoner swap,
the kidnapping,
and that becomes part of the Democratic platform in 1864. And it actually, John C. Fremont runs against Lincoln from the left in 1864, and the radicals also criticize Lincoln for how can you abuse civil liberties by doing a prisoner swap like this.
So Raymond asks, how was Oaksmith received by British society?
It's a great question. He got himself a little cottage, which as far as I can tell is still there. And I've thought about just sending a copy of the book to that address and be like, here's a guy who lived in your house. He got himself a little cottage, and he got back into the merchant business. So he was working as a sailor and as a merchant. And then he also worked as a journalist while he was there. So he wrote for some British newspapers, and his stuff was widely read over there. And he used that journalism as a way to settle some old scores. So he wrote a long essay on William Seward, sort of laying out all of his grievances about Seward.
Yeah. Pamela would like to know if there are photos of Appleton Oaksmith.
There are. I can show you there are a few, and I'll hold one up so that you can see it here. This is him here with his big beard. Appleton ended up settling in New York after this, in North Carolina after the Civil War, got elected to the state legislature, and became an anti-Klan, pro-Black civil rights politician. And because he became prominent in North Carolina, his papers are now preserved at Duke, UNC, and ECU. So his photographs and things and letters and diaries are all still preserved in major university collections.
Incredible. Thanks so much, John. This was wonderful. And as all of you could tell, I hope from this 1 hour that we had together, we're just scratching the surface. This is a very concise book, but there is so much great storytelling and so much great history in here. So I hope that if you haven't already picked it up, you have a chance to do so. John, thanks again for joining us. Phyllis, back to you.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Dr. White, for joining us again. It was a riveting story about Appleton Oaksmith, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. Next up in our Fourscore Speaker Series, we welcome author Nancy Horan on Thursday, October 19th, for a lively discussion on her new historical novel, The House of Lincoln. In addition to this and other Fourscore events coming up this fall, our foundation is proud to partner with the Lincoln Forum and the Kenosha Civil War Museum for the second annual Lincoln Symposium on September 28th and 29th. The symposium will feature tonight's guest, Dr. Jonathan White, who will be joined by other expert Lincoln scholars, including Dr. Lucas Morrell, Dr. Elizabeth Leonard, Dr. Ted Widmer, and Dr. Ron White. So for more information on the symposium or to register for our upcoming speaker series, just visit our website at www.lincolnpresidential.org. Finally, as you close out tonight's webinar, you will see a short survey. We ask that you please take just a moment to complete the survey, as this helps us to improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you would like to see in the future. As always, thank you to each of you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all in October. Good night.